Hiya, I'm Eve. I am an art therapist at Arts for Health. You may have seen some of our art therapy videos. We're doing another video today. Today is with watercolour and we're making an imaginary island. So we're making a map or an image of an imaginary island. So material that you'll need today, I'm going to be using watercolour paint, but if you have some other kind of paint, that's cool too. So you could use acrylic, you could use watercolour, or you might have some oil paint. Those are all great. I'm also going to be using some felt tip markers. If you have another material that you'd like to use alongside paint, like pastel or pencil or crayons, that would be cool too. Then we also need some paper and pen just for our written reflection at the end. So today we're going to be making an image of an imaginary island. It might be an island like a treasure island and you're making a treasure map, or it could just be a normal island without treasure, absolutely fine. The invitation is there. So remember, often we make invitations in art therapy. We invite each other to do something, but we're not saying this is what you must do. So the invite today is to make an imaginary island, to paint an image or a map of an imaginary island. It could have different spaces and places on it, so maybe it's got volcanoes or cliffs, or maybe it's got farms, lots of trees. Maybe you'd prefer yours to be made out of cheese or made out of marshmallow, or maybe your island is part of the moon, or it's a bubble island. It can be absolutely any type of island that suits you with some different areas on it. Then the next invite is to add some sort of treasure to the island, and then the next invite is to add some creature or traveller that moves around the island. So maybe they're looking for the treasure, maybe they're just wandering around, maybe they're doing something totally different. So we've got an island, we've got treasure, and we've got a traveller or a creature that's moving around in some sort of way. So that's the basic overall idea of what we're going to do. One thing about this process today is that because of the materials that we're using, paint and pens and pastels and felt tips, most of those are held in our hand and they're a little bit less stimulating to our senses than some of the other materials we've used in previous processes, in previous videos. So compared to collage, it's a little bit less sensory to use a felt tip pen, and that's absolutely fine. It's just an interesting difference. Our process today is a little bit more in our head and in our emotions and using tools rather than using our hands to really get in touch with, say, collage or sand. We did a sand tray video, or say if we use clay, those are very sensory and very physical kind of materials. The materials that we're using today and the process today, just by the nature of the type of materials, is a little bit more emotions and thoughts. And that's absolutely fine, that's part of our process today. So often it can be useful to talk about what's the overall idea of our process today, what's the aim, what are we doing? And that can be really useful so that we all know what we're here for. So the idea of our process today with our imaginary island and our land that we've made is that it may allow us to explore our internal landscape. So it may allow us to explore what are the resources and the treasures we have in our internal landscape. What's it like to be a traveller around that internal landscape? Now straight away, as soon as I say that, it's very important that I also say, when we talk about this is what this process is all about, you are allowed to make your own meaning and you're allowed to have your own understanding for what the process is about and what your image means to you. So I can say, this island image, maybe it's about the internal island, the internal landscape. But if that doesn't feel accurate for you, then you can make your own meaning. And we really want that. We really want to encourage that, because making your own piece of artwork and then making your own reflection and meaning about that artwork, that's what art therapy is all about. So as you go, just notice, what does this feel like for me? What is this meaning for me as I'm doing my own work? As you do your reflection, what does it mean to you? So we always want our art therapy processes to be empowering and all about personal meaning for you. Okay, let's get started. So I'm going to be talking us through as I make my image and then also as I do my written reflection, and you might be able to see how those two link together. So one of the first things I like to do is touch my page and just get in touch with my body and what's happening for me. So I paused for a second and I had thought about what island do I have in my head,
and I realized that there were some hills and some trees. So I just dived straight into that image that I had just popping up in my head. And what I'm doing here, it was quite a lot based on the tool I'm using, so the paintbrush. I was just letting the paintbrush drop down, and the way it touched the page sort of looked a little bit like rows of trees to me, and I just kept expanding on that idea. I did like the feeling of the hills, so I just kept working on the hills and the trees. I put some other hills in the background, sort of more distant ones, and about at this point I noticed that I had a lot of lines coming up already, and it felt a little bit like crops in lines or farmy kind of paddocks, so I just kept on doing that and expanding that idea. So I noticed something that was going on that I hadn't planned, and I just expanded it and went with it. So we've got a few more crops arriving here. Now I'm mixing a colour. I think when I looked at the brown, I felt like, oh, that reminds me of what a lavender patch looks like in my head. The brown soil under the lavender. So then I just worked on some purple for a while. It was quite enjoyable at this point, putting the dots down. So there was something that I was noticing that was happening for me about lines and dots and repetition. And I haven't painted like this for quite a while, so it was a bit of a new, different thing for me to notice that I was working in very sort of predictable, repeated shapes and lines. So there's nothing wrong with that. I was just noticing that. So I kept working on my crops, and I wanted a few more hills in the background, adding on layers. So here I'm getting a bit more soft and watery. So that feels like a little bit of a nice contrast with all the dots and lines. So I just kept working on trees and crops and the green hills. I did notice that I was using some of the same colours, so obviously a lot of green. That happens a lot for me, that I really enjoy green all the time, and especially at the beginning of an image. I think for me it makes me feel safe and sort of calm, at least to begin with, before I add extra colours. I'm definitely focusing on the topography, sort of the curve and the shape of the land itself, where there's flat, where there's curves, where there's hills. Again, I didn't plan that, but I just kept noticing it and working with it because it felt good. So here I'm starting something that felt a bit sort of swampy to me. So I noticed a swampy feeling, and then I started to think about how that could be the edge of the ocean, the edge of the beach, maybe a sort of a muddy beach, maybe it's a bit more like a mangrovey beach. So I'm getting a little story popping up in my head. Not so much not a strong story, but just, oh, okay, maybe this beach is a bit of a muddy beach, all right. And I just was following that. And then over here I was working on kind of connecting back to the water, so I knew that somewhere around here the water would have to come in. So I put in a little bit of layers of brown for starting off the muddy water, and then I knew that I wanted a cliff. I quite like the idea of an island meeting with the water in a cliff. I went back to working on some trees. I think I sort of felt like this was a vineyard. Something about the lines and the straightness next to the lavender made me think of grapevines. So I did not have a plan, just working on how to build up that edge near the cliff. I'm thinking about how the watercolour sort of moves on the page. I'm thinking about how the colours blend. I'm thinking about little ideas and memories that I have. And just each step I'm just going with the flow. So here I started to add a little bit of darker colour to the cliff, build out the colour a little bit more. Sometimes I felt sure about what I was doing, so I'm sure that this is a cliff and I'd like this to be here and that to be there. And sometimes I didn't really know, and I just kept putting my paintbrush down. So it was like working through lots of different parts of confidence and unconfidence and just going with what felt right to me. So I decided I wanted a bit more stronger colour on on that far side on the left. I'm just adding layers. At this point, I did start to notice that I really enjoyed the way all the greens and browns were blending together, and I started to think, how will I do this water? Because I knew that I wanted water, but I also really liked the peace and the simplicity of the image so far. So I decided to start with a very gentle layer of blue and just see how it felt to me. You can see that the image all of a sudden has a bit more depth to it. But I did actually feel in myself, oh man, I quite liked how isolated the island was when it wasn't touching any water. I sort of liked how it was just floating in midair. But I kept working with this. It's not all about things being perfect or things being as you imagined them. I just kept going, and I do like the blue of the water. So I spent a little while focusing on the wateriness of the watercolour. Of course it was watery when I was doing the hills as well, but I felt like here when I was painting the water, I just could really focus on depth and liquid and the flow of it all. So it's very intuitive, and I'm just adding and adding as things come into my head, as I start to feel how it should go. Here I've gone back to the crops, and this was my little broccoli patch, I think. In my head I thought, oh, maybe these are broccoli or some sort of cabbages, little sort of green dots in a row. So the thing about these dots was just really sticking out to me, that I just kept adding lines and lines and dots and dots. And I was starting to think, wow, it's feeling really good to me to have this predictable, sort of tidy coverage all over the island. Like something about the island was all about someone who had, maybe there was a creature or a person on the island who'd set it all out and said, okay, here we'll have broccoli, here we'll have grapevines, here we'll have pine trees going up the hill. Sort of like there was a little bit of control and harmony on the island. It's not actually that much of a wild island out in the wilderness. There's a little bit of control and peace about it, and I started to notice that, and just in the back of my head I was thinking, okay, that sort of relates to me today. It feels good for me today to have harmony and peace and a little bit of predictability. I'm not always like that. Sometimes I like things to be a little bit more unpredictable and closer to wild and free, but I noticed it and I just went with that because that was what I was feeling today. So I'm just thickening up the cliff, adding more and more details. It's about at this point that I could say, okay, I've done a lot. I've done most elements in the image. Let me just keep working at it and see what pops up after I've done these sort of basic parts. So I've covered most of the sort of original initial ideas that have popped up. Now I'm sort of moving a little bit more to detail and just expanding on different areas. So it's nice to notice when you feel like you've done most of the first layers of your image, and it's cool to have time and energy just to keep adding and see what happens if you keep working at it. So I was thickening up all around the beach and the cliffs and the rocks. For me, this helped bring more reality and ideas to kind of the story and what it might feel like to be on this island. as I keep working on it, more of my imagination can build up about the story of the island. I can tell that I was enjoying myself here because I'm going over some areas and sort of working more and more, like I'm enjoying each of these details. I added a little bit of colour to the sky, just the littlest bit. It's a little bit hard to see here, but just a little colour so that the sky stayed nice and open and peaceful and calm. Not too many colours there. Okay, so this is also a little bit hard to see, but I've got a paintbrush and a little bit of colour on my paintbrush, and now I'm working on the pathway. So I've got a little idea of the different areas in my image. We've got the vineyard and the hill and the lavender. We've got a beach. We've got water around the back. And I'm starting to think about how I might travel between these areas. So here you are, you can see just a few lines coming through. So there's a line where if I was a traveller or a creature on this island, I might walk along that beach. So this is me travelling around my island and exploring it. Walking through the broccoli, going up the hill, going from each hilltop to the next hilltop. So here I started to realise that something that I really would enjoy about this island and about moving around the island would be going from one high point to another high point. Also enjoying exploring all the harvest, all the crops, and then just walking and looking out from the top of each hill. So I just drew little lines and pathways over most of the hills that I felt like I'd like to be at. So this is my way of exploring this island, exploring this land. I decided it would be cool for me to swim out and dive down into the water, so I've got a little line that goes out into the water. And here I realized that the moments of treasure for me were actually some of those high points, some of those moments where you stop and look out at the water or look out over the ocean to the sky. And so again, it's a little bit hard to see because we're a bit zoomed out, but each of those points that I just did, they're kind of moments of treasure and peace. So here I've actually let the painting dry and I'm coming back to add a few details. So I'm adding some water details. So this is interesting for me because I'm not always one to add lots of extra layers once I've sort of connected with the image and done some of it. So here I am just thickening again, adding a few colours to the crops and the land, exploring a little bit more of the pathways. It's like each dot that I did as I went along the pathway was another little footstep. I had put a little creature, a little traveller, just sitting down by the broccoli patch. I guess I started to realise that that might be me as the traveller. Here I am just adding a few details to the little traveller sitting down. I remembered that I'd put in a little bit of a cave in the cliff and I wanted to thicken that and add some colour to that. So we've got the cave, and this just starts, this kind of detail, adding detail part of the process just starts us to think about, okay, what are all the pieces here? So it makes me think about the cave. I've got little fish coming in on the side. I'm thinking about this village way, way, way in the distance by the hills. I've just put in some little dots for little people and huts in a village far away. and I've put in a little boat there at the back. So now I start doing a written reflection. Again, this is not something that we plan. We just start to go straight ahead, writing down what do I notice, what are the parts in the image, how did my body feel, how did my emotions feel. So firstly, I think I wrote about how there was so many dots and lines and crops, as we've talked about. That was something that really stood out to me. Another thing that I wrote about was the similar colours everywhere. So how I had lots of different areas and a few different things going on, but there was still a lot of similarity between the different parts of the island. So the hills were green, and the trees were green, and the grass was green. And how that talked to me about peace and connection and harmony. I was also thinking about how all the crops were there, but that the little traveller creature that I'd put in, I didn't think that they had planted all the crops. So it sort of seemed to me like the traveller was coming in and maybe doing a bit of harvesting and a bit of snacking, collecting some items, but that it was more about just sitting inside that harmony and that sort of productivity of all the crops that were there. Like enjoying that and appreciating, but that it wasn't all about hard work for this creature. I noticed that the pathways were all quite easy to travel. So sometimes when I've done this process before, the pathways can be a bit more up or down or have bridges and roadblocks. But these pathways were all quite smooth, a little bit narrow, but just easy little sort of dirt pathways to walk around almost the whole island. So I noticed that for me personally, that was talking about the ease of moving between different parts of my internal landscape. I noticed, as we said before, about the treasure. So I was writing about how the moments of peace and connection were kind of the moments of treasure that I had as I moved around the island. But I noticed that my moments of resource were those little moments on top of each hill where I was able to come up, or my creature was able to come up. The traveller came to the top of the hill and looked out and connected with the rest of the world. Those moments of contemplation, those were my moments of treasure and resource. So those are some of the things that I noticed as I did my written reflection. I took time to think about what I would want to add into the image and what I would call the image, what title I would call it. So I gave it a title, and I decided that I'd just like to add just a couple of modifications, just a couple of extra things. I wanted to add a little dog to be the companion of the person, of the creature in the island. And I also wanted to add a bag so that I could collect just a few bits of the harvest of the crops. So here I am, just adding a little dog beside me. I had noticed that in the image there was only a village and human connection quite far away. So that's just me noticing, oh, I'd like one little companion that's a little bit closer. And I popped in a little dog there. I put us down, me and my dog and my bag of food, put us down on a picnic blanket. That felt nice. So I could be in connection with the grass, my hands leaning on the grass, but my body also resting on a picnic blanket. And that is my written reflection and my artwork done.
So I've explored my land a little bit. I've done my written reflection, my making meaning for myself here as well. So I've really enjoyed this process. There's lots in it for me. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Come back next time. Let's do another art therapy process together. Thank you for watching.